My speech is probably a little worse prepared than everybody else's, but it's there. You apparently all know who I am as well. I'm delighted that while I know who many of you are, I haven't seen you in many of the audiences that I've had to speak to recently, so hopefully what I said won't sound entirely repetitive from what I said the last time and the time before that. Somebody once said to me, what do you think about BEPS? And I said, well, to answer that question, you really need to do sort of the verbal equivalent of what happens when you have a heart flutter or something like that, and they fix you up with a heart monitor for 24 hours, and it records everything that goes on. If you could record everything that I've said about BEPS over a 24-hour period, we then might be able to harmonize it into something that makes sense. But if you catch me at any particular moment, you'll get a slightly different point of view. As you'll know, I come before you in what I like to think of as a creative, but other people think of as a confusing sort of number of roles. So one is GE, one is the CBI, and one is BEAC. And I will identify when I'm talking about GE, you can figure out where the other ones come in. I want to come back on a number of points that a couple of people have raised, as well as touching on one or two things which haven't already been brought up. Steve mentioned the US as a former US Treasury guy and as somebody who's worked for a US corporation for 15 years now. I think I probably need to come back on this just a little bit. There is, I think, a legitimate concern in the US about the effect that BEPS may have on the US tax base. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first is an obvious one when you think about it, which is that the US has the last worldwide system with a foreign tax credit left in the developed world and in many other parts of the world as well. To put that in very blunt terms, what that means is that the US may end up paying through the foreign tax credit for tax that other people charge. And I think that is a legitimate concern. Fed into that, as Steve and Richard and others have said, if only the US would get its act together and do tax reform. Well, guys, read the Constitution. This is meant to be difficult, and it is difficult. And there are some good things about that, and there are, to be sure, some slightly less good things about that. But it means that nothing moves terribly fast. And one of the things that the US Treasury is rightly concerned about, the Congress also concerned about, is that BEPS is moving much faster, clearly, than US tax reform is going to do. And therefore, some of the money which has been set aside, at least mentally set aside, to pay for US tax reform exists in the foreign area. And if that revenue disappears because other people tax it, then the sums aren't going to work. And what needs to be, for political reasons, a piece of revenue-neutral tax reform legislation is going to be much, much harder. I think that's worth saying. The other thing that I'll say on this is, and this was, I think this was the US who put it in this posture in the first place, is that BEPS has very specifically, explicitly, not been a conversation about source versus residence. I think that was made very clear at the beginning, and that has been followed through. The problem with that, of course, is that in fact almost all of this is a conversation about source versus residence. And what that means, and Richard talked about this as well, what that means is that in fact all of these conversations in a sense are proxies for source versus residence. It's probably clearest in the PE area and the TP area. But what it means is if you're not talking about the subject that you're talking about, then in some senses you're going to come up with some slightly strange results. Now, that's not to say that these things don't work, and it's not to say that incremental change is not good. I am, at least in this sense, still very British. I'm an empiricist. I believe that incrementalism actually is quite a good thing rather than dramatic change. But it does mean that there are some tensions in here which haven't been clear. And I think that's part of where the US comes from in this. So let me move on to some of the other points that haven't been made quite so much. Grace talked a little about implementation. I think I probably paid my compliment to the OECD before Grace walked in, so I'll repeat it, which is that a huge amount of work has been done. I think if you asked us 2.5, 3 years ago, could they have done this? The answer would have been no. You've got to be joking. And actually they have. And they haven't just done it, but actually with high-level consensus, and in some cases much more detailed consensus, across the range. And that is a remarkable achievement in an area where this has normally taken decades rather than years. So that is, I think that is good. That really is good. But the next stage of this, some of you will have heard me use this analogy before. This is a soccer game. This is a football game. actually the delivery of the BEPS recommendations is not the end of the game. It is at best the end of the first half. And the second half of the game still remains, and that's the implementation phase. And if BEPS is to work, if BEPS is to do what it says on the tin, it has to be implemented consistently. And in order for it to be implemented consistently, there needs to be peer pressure. And that peer pressure will, in the end, be provided by OECD, G20, and other countries, looking at what other countries do. So if you look at the Forum on Transparency, this is the model which works. And we need something like that. Now, the G20, thankfully, in their declaration from the finance ministers meeting in Ankara, asked the OECD to look at this. The OECD will deliver a plan by the end of January, which looks towards implementation. Grace is smiling. We won't ask her why. To deliver a plan which talks about that. Now, obviously, there are elements to that. Part of it is, a simple question, are they implementing it? Obviously, the more interesting question and the more important question is, how are they implementing it? Are they implementing it consistently with that? I think this is an incredibly important part of BEPS. And it's, the benefits both to countries and to business, and if we're being sort of slightly more abstract, to economies, will only flow if there is this consistent implementation, whatever you might think about some of the rules, if there is this consistent implementation. So I would very much, support that. And one of the things that I've said, and I suppose wearing the BEAC hat here in particular, is that business is very prepared, as we have been all along, I hope, to play a constructive role in this part of the process. Whether it's formal or informal, how it is in terms of feeding information about what's going on. Governments may see things one way, business may see things another way. Again, if you can push that information into the process so that it's part of it, then I think that process will be better. Moving on to the next point, as I said to David, however, at some levels, in some of the recommendations, the agreement is still pretty high level, and there is more work that needs to be done. Some of that is explicitly acknowledged in the work program that Grace talked about, which goes out to 2016, and in fact, in some cases, with profit splits out to 2017. There are other places, whether it's inside transfer pricing or Ps, or even interest deductibility, which I'm going to talk about the latter two in a moment, where we still need more detail and where countries need to, the working parties and others who are involved in this need to flesh out those details so that there is less room for divergence, which is the thing, again, which in the end impedes cross-border trade and investment, which is, I think, what everybody wants. I hope what everybody wants. So let me talk about Ps. Richard has talked about this and a couple of others. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this. And I'm going to talk very briefly about four of the areas. So the first is the dependent agent rules. The second is preparatory and auxiliary. The third is fragmentation. And the fourth, maybe I'll talk about the independent agent. Maybe I won't. I think Richard actually dealt with that sufficiently. So, I agree with Richard. The dependent agent change came in right at the end, basically in July. There was no time. This is not a criticism. There was no time to fill in the details below that. So, I'm not going to tell you whether I agree with that standard or whether I disagree with that standard. I think the standard could be tight. I think it could be very tight. I think also it could be relatively loose. And it was certainly brought in to try and stop flybys by the CEO, for example, qualifying as a permanent establishment. In that sense, clearly it's good. As some of my colleagues who know a lot more about this than I do, pointed out to me, actually it's strange that the language which comes immediately after that says something along the lines of, if you have absolutely no room for negotiation, it's a standard contract, then that's a sign of a PE. And you're thinking, actually, isn't it the fact that we have more discretion in that person? So, they're just things that we need to sort out here. And again, it's not to say that it's good or bad. I mean, it is absolutely clear from the politics and indeed from the economics. I agree with Steve on this, that, that there are some situations where people sort of belly right up to the line and then the contract gets entered into somewhere else. If all the value-adding activity, other than the actual signature of the contract, is going on in one place, then, at some level, guys, it makes sense to actually, allow some taxation of that. The contract conclusion rule has one overwhelming advantage. It's certain, it's clear, and there's a very bright line there. So, again, as we've said all along, if we're going to change the rule, let's just change it in a way that, sure, accommodates what, gets to where governments need to be, but draws that line fairly brightly. On preparatory and auxiliary, again, you can see why people might think that in certain cases, and casting aspersions on anybody, that warehousing may actually be a critical part of your business model. And it may not truly be preparatory and auxiliary. So, okay, go at it. The danger, of course, is that there may be other cases where warehousing truly is preparatory and auxiliary, and countries would not wish to argue that it is. So again, as we go down this road, and as let's try and refine this to make it clearer. And I don't think in that case that allowing optionality out of what is a now general rule that all of the exceptions in 5.4 have to be preparatory and auxiliary quite does it. So again, a little more work needed there. With fragmentation, again, I completely understand where people are coming from, both temporally in terms of splitting up by time, but also to a certain extent splitting it up by activities. There are concerns there which do need to be dealt with. On the other hand, there are good non-tax reasons in certain cases for splitting up things, whether it's for legal liability reasons or whatever, where you might want to split it up. So again, let's work this through. And of course, there is always the danger, although in this case, probably less so because treaties take longer to negotiate and the multilateral agreement won't be available for at least a year, that people take these concepts and say, great, we're done, we're going to put it in, without that further explanation. And if you want an example of where this has actually taken place, I'd love to give this one because very few people have come across it. In the China-Chile tax agreement, tax treaty entered into in March of this year, they lifted out of the draft, not out of the final version, they lifted out of the draft all of these provisions and just stuck them in the tax treaty. So, again, this can happen, and we need to keep an eye on that. And then one final point about permanent establishments, he says, looking at the clock a little nervously, is that obviously once you've established as a permanent establishment, that's only actually the first part of the discussion, and for many countries not the most interesting part of the discussion. The most interesting part is, well, what profit do I attribute to that? And obviously that's work which remains to be done. There is a deadline of the end of 2016, and I prefer, I think at this point, to view that as an opportunity to continue to input into the process rather than worrying about what countries are going to do in the interim. Interest deductibility, Steve has dealt with this, I think, pretty fully. I've scribbled down about half a page of notes here, and I only have a page of notes. I've scribbled half a page of notes trying to refute what Mike Devereaux has said about interest deductibility. Mike and I have known each other for a long time now, and the only thing upon which we have consistently disagreed over, I think probably over 10 years now, is interest deductibility. I would simply say that I don't think it's quite as simple as Mike makes it out to be. On the other hand, if you start from a series of assumptions rather than the real world, that does make it a little easier. And I think what I would probably say, if I was being a little more polite, having been rude about it, what I would say is that if you were starting to design something with a blank sheet of paper, you would probably come up with a different answer than if you were starting with the situation we currently have and trying to decide how to make it better. There are advantages to debt. I think the situation isn't as clear in terms of deductibility and inclusion, particularly once you start to take into account, in a cross-border setting, once you start to take into account things like dividend exemption regimes, which sort of break that link between taxation in one country or taxation in another. So, I just think as we look at this, let's be careful about it. I'll go back to what I said before about being essentially incremental in this. I think in general, as Steve said, that 30% of EBITDA will cover most people. And what BEPS is meant to do really is to stop the stuff at the edges. It's not to totally redesign the tax system. So I think that's fine. I'm going to make a GE point here, which is that there are still some concerns inside interest deductibility. There's a very good faith attempt to deal with capital-intensive industries, and in particular to deal with certain types of funding in those capital-intensive projects. But if you look at something like infrastructure, where most of the project financing actually takes place in debt form, there are going to be certain circumstances, either where the public interest exception is quite tightly drawn, maybe too tightly drawn, and others where, particularly if you're in a larger setting, the group-wide ratio won't quite do it for you. So again, I think these are just things that we need to work through in the same way that I agree, financial services is it's a separate area and clearly needs to be looked at more. So I'll stop on interest deductibility. I want to go to a point that Richard raised about the behavioral impacts of BEPS. I think this is fascinating, actually, perhaps the most interesting part of the BEPS project in a way, because as we all know, particularly those of us who've been doing this for too long, probably, you can change the law, and you can keep changing the law, and you can add more to the law, and you can keep doing that. But if you don't, at the same time, get some type of behavioral change, all you're going to do is make this into a game of cat and mouse, which can go on for years and years and years. And there are plenty of clever people in the government. There are plenty of clever people in the private sector. And it will continue to be a game. There can only be a game changer here if you also change people's behavior. And as Richard said, you see some of that with the initial reactions to BEPS, whether it's, there have been lots of examples in the newspapers about what certain IP-rich companies have said that they're going to do, which is different from what they've previously been doing. I can tell you that, we look at this inside. We still don't know exactly what some of the changes are going to be, but we say, okay, well, here's how we may want to think about things in the future. And certainly, the linking of substance and taxation clearly is going to be a dominant theme. However, the details of that get worked out. But that's not enough, because you need to institutionalize this behavioral change. You can have a one-time impact, and you can come back again, and you can try and do it in 5 or 10 years' time. But really what you need to do is something which changes behavior on a regular basis. And I'm not going to go into this, mostly because I don't have time. But another of the OECD projects, although more the sort of the purview of the former Tax Administration than the Committee on Fiscal Affairs, so administration rather than policy, is cooperative compliance. And the idea that simply if you get people in a room, you get taxpayers and tax authorities in a room early on and make them talk, essentially, at some stage you're going to build up enough trust that actually you're going to cut back on some of the aggressive tax planning, but taxpayers will also get out of it the certainty that we always say we want. So I think that's important. And the FTA has a huge role to play here, also in dispute resolution and the MAP forum. So again, cooperative compliance, soft law as well as hard law, basically. And that's, I think that is a really important message. I wanted to mention just briefly the scope of BEPS. So this is action item 11. This will excite the economists in the room and probably not many other people. But this is an important thing. And the reason why I find it important is because there's an estimate of the cost of BEPS in the report, which ranges from roughly 100 to 250 billion. It's actually 240, I guess. But anyway, that's the range. And it says it may be conservative. Or it may not. Certainly there are some who've come up with 1 trillion figures who think it highly conservative. There are others who think that, maybe that sounds about right, and there are others who probably think actually it sounds too high. It is an important question, though, and therefore I think it's one that we need to continue to look at, because if it's 1 trillion, then you are going to come up with a different quality of answer, I suppose, than you would do if it was 100 billion. 100 billion sounds like an awful lot of money. But actually, in terms of a world economy of trillions and trillions and trillions, it isn't that much. So, I think it's worth continuing to look at this, particularly as we refine BEPS going forward, because it goes to this question of, should this be broad brush? Should this be something which affects everybody? Or is this something which should be much more targeted? And particularly a really aggressive avoidance at the edges. So I think that's an important question worth going on to. And this leads me into my final point, you'll be glad to hear, which is that one of the things that I think we now need to do, the BEPS conversation was a conversation which had to be had. And for those of you who thought that, either it could be avoided or that we can go back to the good old days, I have bad news for you because you're wrong on both counts. This was a political conversation. This was not really a tax policy conversation. And it was a political conversation which was going to happen because, honestly, the pendulum had swung too far. That's just the way things go. The pendulum had swung too far, and we needed to have this conversation. And I think, I've always been very clear about this, that if we were going to have this conversation, the context in which I wanted to have it was at the OECD with the G20, so you have 90% of the world's GDP around the table. To Janine's point, I'm very glad that the developing countries have been pulled into it. But this was something that needed to be happen, and some of these excesses needed to be taken out of the system. And whether those are excesses which lead to 100 billion of loss, or whether they're excesses that lead to 1 trillion of loss, in that sense is irrelevant. Because either of those numbers is large enough to get the public worked up. And once we lose trust, and in particular once trust is lost in a voluntary tax system, then we are in really bad trouble. So this was a conversation that needed to be had. Having been had, we now need to broaden the conversation back out again. So this is now, with the BEPS recommendations, as we come to implementations, we come to think about this over the next couple of years, 5 to 10 years, We also need to put this back in the context of the larger economy, and also back in the context of what the OECD has always done very well, which is to promote cross-border trade investment. Why do we want to promote cross-border trade investment? Well, it's not just to favor big bad corporations. Actually, it's because it creates growth, it creates wealth, it puts food on the table, it gives people jobs. Everybody's better off. There are good reasons for cross-border trade and investment as well. And therefore, I would like us to think about, over the next few years, how we put tax back in this context, keeping the insights of BEPS, but also, again, looking to how tax can be used to further cross-border trade and investment. So yes, we worry about double non-taxation. Yes, we worry about double taxation. But we also see what there is in the tax system that can be used to promote that. The obvious and simple example of a tax credit, at least at the moment, most people think is a good one, is an R&D credit. Are there other things like that that we should be thinking about? Again, going back to my GE point, apparently, the estimates are we need somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion of additional infrastructure investment each year. That's not going to come mostly from governments. It's going to come from the private sector. Again, we need to think how we facilitate the things that we actually want to facilitate, how we prevent the things that we want to prevent. And just as a final plug for the OECD, this actually is something the OECD is thinking about. I would encourage Grace, as I've encouraged her before, to say that we support a project which looks at tax and trade and investment. And again, how you begin to pull all of these things together to get us to a place where we essentially have restored stability in the sense of, the public don't think that they're being ripped off, businesses don't think they're being unduly imposed upon, and we also, keep this idea that actually in the end what we want to do is to make everybody's lives better. I mean, it is a relatively simple thing, but that's, I think, what we should be aiming for. I'll stop there.